Trust between a parent and a teenager rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. That is why parents so often miss its decline. They are waiting for the obvious event, the slammed door, the screaming match, the secret account, the major lie, the terrifying phone call, the night the child does not come home. Emotionally or physically, in the same way they left. But by the time those moments appear, the real story is usually older. Trust has often been leaking quietly through ordinary interactions that seemed too small to matter. A parent reads the text thread just this once. A child confesses something and receives a lecture longer than their courage. A private fear gets repeated to another relative as conversation. A disagreement turns into emotional punishment. A question becomes an interrogation. A request for privacy gets interpreted as rebellion. Piece by piece, the teenager begins updating one of the most important calculations of adolescence. Is honesty with you emotionally safe enough to be worth the risk? Teenagers are often described as secretive by nature. That is only partly true. Adolescence does require privacy. It requires experimentation, internal distance, changing loyalties, a developing self that cannot remain fully transparent to parents without being stunted. Healthy teenagers pull back. They try on identities. They stop narrating every thought. That is normal. But there is a crucial difference between privacy and defensive secrecy. Privacy says, I am becoming a person. Defensive secrecy says, you are not safe enough for the truth. The first is development. The second is relationship damage. Parents who cannot distinguish between them often create the very hiding they fear. They tighten control in order to force closeness, and the teenager responds by becoming less reachable, more strategic, and more emotionally careful. One of the fastest ways to lose trust is through surveillance disguised as concern. A parent checks the phone without permission, enters the room without knocking, reads journals, scans browser history, tracks location with an intensity that turns safety into constant scrutiny. The parent tells themselves this is responsible. Sometimes, in genuine risk situations, checking is necessary. But when surveillance becomes the emotional default, the teenager learns something corrosive. They learn that privacy is treated as suspicious until proven innocent. They learn that the parent's anxiety outranks the teenager's dignity. Most importantly, they learn that honesty does not buy them trust. It buys them closer inspection. Once that lesson lands, concealment begins to look rational. Not because the teenager is malicious, but because hiding becomes the only remaining territory in which a self can breathe. A second rupture happens when parents make emotional stability contingent on agreement. The teenager makes a choice you dislike, says something sharp, pulls away, wants a boundary, disagrees with your interpretation, or simply fails to perform gratitude in the right tone. In response, the parent becomes cold, wounded, sarcastic, theatrically disappointed, or silently punishing. The message is unmistakable. Your autonomy is emotionally expensive for me. This is devastating in adolescence because teenagers are supposed to practice separation. They need to test the edges of your influence without feeling that every act of individuation will destabilize the home. When parents cannot tolerate that process, many teenagers split in one of two directions. Some become openly oppositional, Because if love is already unstable, they may as well be honest. Others become compliant on the surface while withdrawing internally, which looks easier to the parent and is often far more damaging. In both cases, trust weakens because the child learns that truth must be filtered through parental fragility. A third mistake is turning every disclosure into a lesson. Your teenager tells you school felt humiliating, and before the feeling has landed, you are optimizing. Here is what they should have done. Here is what resilience looks like. Here is how the world works. Here is what happened when you were their age. None of this comes from bad motives. Parents want to help. But teenagers are unusually sensitive to whether a conversation is actually about them or about what they should become. When every opening leads to advice, they stop opening. Not because they hate wisdom, but because they want to be understood before they are improved. Trust depends on emotional sequence. First contact, then counsel. If you reverse it consistently, your teenager will eventually save the vulnerable parts of life for friends, strangers online, romantic partners, or no one at all. Another way trust dies is when parents weaponize vulnerability later. The child tells you who they like, what scares them, what they are ashamed of, where they feel insecure, what they regret, what they secretly want. Then, during some future argument, those disclosures reappear as ammunition, jokes, warnings, or evidence. It does not matter whether you intended cruelty. The adolescent brain hears only one thing. My honesty can be converted into a weapon. After that, the teenager may still tell you facts, but the deep interior goes underground. Trust requires memory with discipline. Parents must be able to hold what was disclosed during softness without spending it during conflict. Not because all honesty is beyond consequence, but because using vulnerability as leverage teaches a child that emotional openness is strategically dangerous. Trust also erodes when parents break confidentiality under the banner of family closeness. A teenager tells one parent something private and later discovers that the information has been shared with the other parent, a sibling, a grandparent, a family friend, or the entire dinner table. The adults may be bonded by openness. The teenager experiences exposure. Parents often tell themselves that family should have no secrets, but teenagers are not asking for secrecy in the corrupt sense. They are asking for control over who knows what about their own developing self. If that control is repeatedly taken away, two consequences follow. First, the teenager stops speaking spontaneously. Second, they become highly strategic in what version of themselves the family gets. The parent then complains that the teenager is distant, not realizing that distance was built by repeated violations of informational trust. Then there is inconsistency, one of the most underrated destroyers of trust. A teenager can tolerate rules better than adults think. What they struggle with is unpredictability. Yesterday privacy mattered, today it does not. Yesterday honesty was praised, today honesty triggered panic. Yesterday you said, "Tell me anything." Today your reaction makes that feel like a trap. Yesterday your child was treated as mature. Today the same judgment call is recast as evidence of irresponsibility because the outcome scared you. Inconsistency teaches a terrible lesson. The truth will not be evaluated by principle, but by your mood, your fear, your embarrassment, or the story you are telling yourself that day. Once that becomes the emotional climate, teenagers stop gambling on honesty. They manage exposure instead. Perhaps the most painful rupture of all occurs when parents confuse access with relationship. They believe that because they know the grades, the schedule, the friend group, the location, the passwords, and the basic facts, closeness remains intact. But trust is not measured by how much data you possess. It is measured by how much truth your teenager volunteers when they could hide it. Data can be extracted. Trust cannot. A teenager can obey curfews, hand over devices, answer questions, and still be emotionally gone. Many parents discover this too late. They interpret lowered conflict as maturity, cooperation, or improved parenting, when in reality, the teenager has simply concluded that honesty is expensive and emotional distance is efficient. Silence feels like peace to the parent because the parent no longer hears the struggle. To the teenager, silence feels like strategy. So how do parents protect trust without abandoning authority? First, stop treating privacy as the enemy of connection. Knock. Ask before checking. Explain clearly when and why you need to intervene, and do not turn intervention into a standing identity judgment. Second, regulate your reactions enough that truth does not immediately become punishment. This does not mean no consequences. It means the initial response should protect the channel before you address the behavior. Third, learn the discipline of curiosity. Ask fewer prosecutorial questions and more orienting ones. What happened? What made that hard? What were you hoping for? What were you afraid of? Fourth, keep your word about confidentiality unless safety truly requires otherwise. And when safety requires disclosure, explain that directly instead of smuggling it through the back door. Fifth, remember that your child's honesty is not proof of your excellence as a parent. It is proof that the relationship currently feels safer than concealment. That safety must be maintained, not assumed. There is also a profound difference between being informed and being invited. Informed parents know what happened after the fact. Invited parents are the ones teenagers come to before the situation has fully broken apart. Invitation is the real prize, and it cannot be demanded. It is earned through a long pattern of being emotionally survivable. If your teenager believes your first goal is understanding rather than control, they will tell you more. If they believe your first goal is control, they will tell you only what control requires. This is why many parents who care deeply still find themselves shut out. Caring is not the only variable. Emotional safety is. If you are already seeing signs of distrust, shorter answers, less eye contact, selective honesty, jokes in place of vulnerability, anger whenever you ask questions, a life that seems increasingly inaccessible, do not panic and double down on force. That usually confirms the teenager's fear. Instead, audit the relationship for small betrayals. Where has privacy been treated as guilt? Where has honesty been punished with emotional excess? Where has vulnerability been recycled into conflict? Where have you demanded openness without offering steadiness? Repair begins there, often quietly. An apology for overreacting. a promise kept, a private disclosure not shared, a conversation where you listen longer than you speak. A moment when the teenager expects a lecture and receives understanding first. These moments do not erase the past, but they alter the forecast. And if this helped you see trust not as a vague ideal, but as a daily relational asset that can be invested or depleted, subscribe. This channel is for people who want to understand family life with more precision than slogans can offer. And send this video to one person genuinely close to you. Someone with whom you want to build healthier, wiser relationships around the children you both care about. A teenager does not need parents who know everything. They need parents whose presence makes honesty less costly than hiding. Because in the end, most teenagers do not stop telling the truth because they no longer have one. They stop telling it because they have learned where truth goes to die. It dies in overreaction, in surveillance, in weaponized vulnerability, in breached confidentiality, in parental fragility, in the constant feeling that being known comes with too high an emotional price. Change that price, and trust often starts breathing again. It may help to think of trust less as an emotion and more as a ledger. Every family has deposits and withdrawals. A deposit is when a teenager tells the truth and the parent stays regulated enough to receive it. A deposit is when privacy is respected until a real safety issue emerges. A deposit is when a parent can hold complexity without collapsing into panic, shame, or control. A withdrawal is when information shared in confidence becomes family gossip. A withdrawal is when your child's confession turns into a performance about your disappointment. A withdrawal is when the teenager's ordinary need for separateness is treated like disloyalty. Most parents focus on the big events, but trust usually changes through the small arithmetic. 1 or 2 severe betrayals matter, of course. So do 50 minor ones that teach the same lesson more gently and therefore more permanently. It is also worth understanding how humiliation works in adolescence. Teenagers can tolerate rules far better than they can tolerate being made small. Public correction, sarcasm, mocking their tone, exposing their secrets, comparing them to siblings, reading their private life aloud, treating their emotional intensity as ridiculous. These do not just cause temporary conflict. They make the parent feel unsafe as a witness. Once a teenager believes you cannot observe them without reducing them, they will stop letting you observe much. What follows often looks like rudeness, but it is frequently self-protection. The child is trying to survive your access. Repair, when it comes, requires more than extracting another confession. It often starts with a parent saying something most teenagers almost never hear from authority. "I can see why you stopped telling me." That sentence matters because it does not defend the adult before naming the impact. It shows the teenager that the parent can step outside their own intention long enough to look at the relationship from the other side. From there, other sentences become possible. "I want to handle your honesty better. I don't want your privacy to feel criminal by default. I'm going to be more careful with what you tell me." These are not magic lines, but spoken sincerely and backed by repeated behavior, they can reopen channels that force never will. What teenagers need from parents is not blind trust and not invasive certainty. They need what might be called sturdy trust, the kind that remains interested, boundaried, informed by reality, and still respectful enough that the adolescent does not have to choose between development and dignity. Sturdy trust understands that a teenager can make bad decisions and still deserve privacy, can lie and still deserve a path back to honesty, can be secretive and still be asking in hidden ways whether home is safe enough for the truth. The parents who preserve trust best are not the ones who eliminate risk. They are the ones whose authority does not humiliate the child's becoming. So before the next device check, the next confrontation, the next "we need to talk," ask yourself what the deeper message will be. Will your teenager leave that interaction believing honesty remains viable? Or will they conclude, once again, that the truth costs more than concealment? That calculation is happening all the time, and it shapes the relationship long before the parent sees the final result.